Prior to the 2016 election, I was calling for Ambassador Kislyak to be PNG'd from this country. Prior to the 2016 election, I was trying to say how this sustained covert influence operation by the Russians had to be addressed. Grisly step, what the intelligence community refers to the attempts by the Russian government to influence our election, is going to go down in history as the Russian intelligence greatest covert influence operation. Why? Because their goal, and Mr. Hall, you alluded to this, is to erode trust in our democratic institutions. It is to erode trust in the American people and the intelligence services, to erode trust between the intelligence services and the legislative branch. Its goal is to erode trust between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And I've sat here for 22 months and having many of my colleagues question our side of the aisle's commitment and understanding that the Russians is a threat. It's clear, Republicans and Democrats on this committee agree the Russians attempted to influence our election. They tried to do it in 18, they're gonna try to do it in 20, they're doing it in Moldova, they've done it in Armenia, they're gonna continue to do that. And so when we question that, when we imply that there is not an agreement on that particular issue, we are falling into the trap of eroding trust in our institutions. And we have to change our behavior. We have to get at this threat because they are continuing to do it and they're very good and we're not prepared for that. And Mr. Hall, my question for you, who is responsible for counter covert influence? And who should be responsible for that in the US government?
I think given how the Russians have evolved in terms of their capabilities, their hybrid warfare, their influence operations, all of those different disciplines, I believe that it actually now in the United States needs to be an all-of-government approach if such a thing is possible. Obviously, we need to have certain folks taking the leads. The intelligence community has to inform what's going on. There's a military component to it because I think we need to protect critical infrastructure. But it touches, the way that the Russians are doing it now, it touches so many different parts of our government and indeed our society that it's got to be a widespread thing. So unfortunately, I don't know that I can name one person, one agency, one organization to do it. It's too broad now.
Thank you. Ambassador McFall.
All of that said, I also want to make sure, in my view, we understand that the answer to your question is not just an intel question, it's a policy question.
For sure.
The President of the United States needs to stand next to Vladimir Putin and say, we know what you did in 2016, and if you do it again, these are going to be the consequences. And until the President of the United States doesn't do that, it's not good enough for the rest of the Trump administration to try to do that. I know a lot of those people. I think they've got a pretty good policy towards Russia. I actually do. And in some of the things, they were better than us in terms of our policy in the Obama administration. But when the President of the United States, standing right next to him in Helsinki, sides with Putin and not your former colleagues, that does the very damage that you just described about trust in our
Mr. McFall, I've made my opinions on this topic very clear. But what I will end with, before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I left a job as an undercover officer in the CIA because I was disgusted with the things I had to do and the lack of knowledge that congressional leaders had, and when I had to brief them when I was overseas. I felt that there were people in Congress at that time that were going against the opposite of what my friends and my colleagues were doing, not just in the CIA, but in the military, in our foreign service. And I was disgusted with that, and I said, I gotta try to do something about it. And it's great to be able to help the intelligence community in a different way by serving on this committee. But what we need to do is stop with the innuendo, stop with abusing our position and implying we have access to something that we do not have access. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would only mention that to my colleague, that in the last session, the majority produced a report that suggested to the American people that the intelligence community's conclusion that Russia had intervened, and in fact intervened to help one candidate and hurt the other, should be subject to doubt. That the intelligence community didn't use the proper tradecraft, that conclusion should be called into question. I don't think that that was in the service of the country. I don't think that's reflected in any of the intelligence. I don't think that's going to be reflected in Bob Mueller's report. And that was the unanimous opinion of the then majority. Every member of this panel who was a part of that signed that report. And I fully concur, Mr. Hurd, that we need to be very clear about Russian intervention. We need to all condemn it on a bipartisan basis. We should show no daylight in that. We'll never know whether that intervention was decisive in the election. I've never suggested it was. We don't know, and our intelligence community, though the president has represented that that's what they concluded, that's not their job, and of course that wasn't their conclusion. It's beyond their role and their capability to predict election outcomes. Ambassador McFall?
Would the gentleman yield to
Yes.
Is it normal within the Directorate of Intelligence, or I guess it's now the Directorate of Analysis, for a senior analyst involved in a subject matter to be excluded from the review of all source intelligence on that subject?
Mr. Hurd, you and I can carry on this conversation, or we can ask the experts whether they have any reason to question the intelligence community's assessment that the Russians intervened on one side and not the other. Shall we put it to the witnesses?
I doubt they will have the opportunity to speak on classified materials, but I would love to talk about the process on how intelligence has been developed and how all source intelligence should be developed. And again, there is no question about the ICA assessment about the Russians' attempt to influence our elections. But tradecraft, standards of tradecraft are standards of tradecraft. And when there is a deviation from that standard of tradecraft, we should understand why.
Well, Mr. Castro, you are up next, if you'll indulge me. Let me ask the witnesses, does anyone on this panel question the intelligence community's finding that the Russians intervened in our election and did so for the purpose of helping one candidate and hurting the other?
Would the gentleman yield to add an additional question?
I'd like to allow the witnesses to answer. Does anyone question that? Ms. Conley?
No, I do not question it.
Ambassador?
No
Mr.
question.
Hall? Mr. Lorber? Mr. Castro, you're recognized.
Mr. Castro, would the gentleman yield for 20 seconds, please, sir?
Sure.
I would welcome the gentleman asking the question if any of the panelists knew how the ICA was developed and whether their understanding of the process on which it was vetted through the intelligence agency. And I yield
They
back.
can
Thank
give
you,
an answer there. I'll let him answer your question, Will.
I have no knowledge of the process.
Neither do I.
I have no direct knowledge, but it would be difficult for me to imagine that the heads of the intelligence organizations would stand up and vouch for it if there were not some integrity to it, but that's speculation on my part.
Likewise, I have no knowledge of the process.